The last part in this topic on nervous system organization is a quick look at the vertebrate brain. I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning before we get into any of the details here, that this section of the book is extremely detailed. You are not responsible for all of those details. You're only responsible for what we're talking about here. So starting with embryonic development, remember, the brain develops from that neural tube that forms during neurulation that we talked about during development 2. So that's a single tube of tissue. The anterior end folds over, as I've shown you already today. I'm not gonna pull out the sleeve again, but you've seen that already. So that anterior end folds over, the part that folds becomes the brain, the rest of that neural tube remains as a single tube, and that becomes the spinal cord. Now, vertebrate brains all have the same basic components. The thing that varies is the relative size, which reflects the use of the different parts. So for example, here we have fish, bird, and mammal brains, and looking at these three, we could see a few differences in terms of the components. So for example, the fish, you have this region in blue right here. We're going to get into what the regions are, but for now, I just want to give you the idea that this region in blue is related to like spatial awareness. And it's a lot bigger, relatively speaking, in fish and birds compared to mammals. Well, that makes sense because fish live in a three-dimensional environment where they're swimming, and birds are flying, so they also have to be really good at things like balance and spatial awareness. Mammals are primarily just walking on the ground, so your typical mammalian brain spatially only has to operate in 2 dimensions primarily rather than 3. So the relative volume of the brain that's dedicated to something like balance in 3-dimensional space is going to be less compared to the fish or the bird. In contrast, the mammal brain has this much larger region, which has to do with things like reasoning and problem solving, which mammals tend to be better at than organisms like fish or birds. The main thing I want you to get here is not anything specific about these 3 groups of organisms. We haven't even named the parts of the brain yet. The thing I want you to get here is that the relative size of the different parts of the brain reflects the importance of the functions associated with that region within a particular lifestyle or for a particular species. So we're going to go through the human brain. We're only going to cover kind of the big picture structures here. Again, the key thing is follow the things that are red and bold. Those are the terms you need to know. The summary figure here has a lot more terms in it. You're only responsible for what we cover. Within the human brain, the largest and most prominent part is this big part in yellow. It's called the cerebrum. This is the part of the brain that is involved with functions like voluntary movement, learning, emotion, memory, perception. Different parts of the cerebrum are involved with different parts of, or different functions. You probably learned like the different parts of the cerebral cortex in psychology if you have taken psych. Don't worry about it for Gen Bio. I just want you to get big idea that this part of the brain is involved in a lot of like higher order things like emotion and also things like planning and problem solving, in particular this frontal part. You don't need to know that. But this big frontal lobe is what really sets humans apart from everybody else. That's where we do things like problem solving and planning. The cerebrum is divided into left and right hemispheres, and kind of the interesting and weird thing here is that perception and control are actually reversed between the hemispheres. What we mean by that is that the right visual field, if you just consider the eyes, the right visual field is actually perceived by the left side of the brain. It's not a right eye, left eye thing. It's a right visual field versus left visual field. So you have the neurons that take in the stimuli from the left side of the visual field. I know my right from my left. Over here, the left side of the visual field. The neurons that take in that signal bring it to the right side of the brain. The neurons that take in the right visual field take that signal to the left side of the brain. The 2 sides of the brain are connected by a structure called the corpus callosum, which is this really thick band of axons, and it's this structure right here, but like you're not going to have to identify it. It connects the 2 hemispheres of the cerebrum. And this is really important because it allows your entire brain to ultimately process both visual fields. Now again, if you've taken psych or are taking psych, you may have talked about split brain disorders or split brain injuries where the corpus callosum is damaged or severed, and that has some really interesting effects because the 2 halves of the brain are actually responsible for a couple of different things in terms of like processing visual information versus auditory information and then different types of outputs. So you'll talk about that more in psych if and when you take psych, but just keep in mind that it's an interesting series of things. It's related to damage to the corpus callosum, and that's only possible because of the reversed perception and control associated with the left and right hemispheres. Now, kind of in the back over here, we have a structure called the cerebellum. This is really highly involved with movement and balance and things like coordination and motor skills. A few specific things that the cerebellum is involved with are things like the position of joints and the lengths of muscles. So, are your muscles stretched or contracted? The cerebellum is going to be the part of your brain that ultimately makes that determination. Because your ears and your eyes are involved in balance, your cerebellum is also taking sensory input information from those two organs, your eyes and your ears, because that's going to be involved in keeping yourself upright. And there's an interesting thing you can do with that that shows just how involved your eyes are in balance. So what I want you to do is stand on one foot with your eyes open and see how long you can do it before you start to wobble and fall over and have to put down your leg. Then do the same thing, but do it with your eyes closed. Now, with your eyes open, after a minute, just stop because you're not going to fall over. Then do it with your eyes closed and see how long it takes. And what you'll see is it's easier to fall over with your eyes closed compared to with your eyes open, because your eyes are involved in balance and they're sending that information to the cerebellum. So make sure you have enough room to do it and you're in kind of a safe spot to do it, but then try to balance on one foot with your eyes open and closed, and you can see the importance of your eyes when it comes to balance. Now, because the cerebellum is involved in things like balance and motor coordination, damage to the cerebellum often leads to permanent loss of motor skills, and that can be kind of large-scale motor skills like balance, or it could be more fine motor skills. One last note about the cerebellum that's really interesting is that we've talked about learning as a use it or lose it kind of thing, where you can learn information or skills. We've talked about both like facts, but also skills like playing an instrument. And if you don't do those things, if you don't practice over time, you're going to lose that stuff. But there are some things in life that you never forget how to do. Things like riding a bike, right? You never forget how to ride a bike or how to swim. The reason for that is things that involve balance, like riding a bike, are actually the memory for how to do that is mediated through the cerebellum rather than the cerebrum. Memories in the cerebellum don't have that use it or lose it aspect to them. So once you learn how to do something that involves the cerebellum, you have it for the rest of your life. And that's why you never forget how to ride a bike. Getting into the middle of the brain, there's a region called the diencephalon that contains two important structures. First is the thalamus, which is the main input center for sensory information. So right here, basically all of your sensory receptors send the signal to the thalamus, and then that signal is going to be routed to the correct part of the cerebrum. Right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which we have already talked about a lot. So here's the hypothalamus below the thalamus. So we've got thalamus right here, hypothalamus down here. We've already talked about the hypothalamus a lot in terms of how it regulates the pituitary, both the anterior and the posterior pituitary. But it's also involved in a lot of very basic life functions and responses. So now we're getting into the parts of the brain that are much more ancestral. So they're going to be involved in much more basic things instead of things like reasoning or balance. The hypothalamus, for example, is involved in hunger and thirst, it's involved in sex, and it's also involved in rage. One easy way to remember what the hypothalamus does is that it's responsible for the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. The 4 F's. All of these 4 F's are very basic life functions, which reflects the fact that the hypothalamus is a very ancient part of the brain. And then finally, we get to the brain stem. This is going to be, I'll show you the figure in a minute, but the brain stem has 3 components to it, and they're all also, like the hypothalamus, involved in very basic life functions. So you have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is involved in receiving and integrating sensory information, so it comes in kind of through the brain stem, then it gets routed to the thalamus. The pons has to do with respiration and sleep, so a lot of this has to do with like rhythms. and regulating the rate of various activities in your body. And the medulla is the very bottom part. It's continuous with the spinal cord. So this is responsible for very basic life functions. We're talking about respiration, heartbeat, regulating the blood pressure, and also a couple of basic responses that just tell the body to stay alive in kind of sticky situations. So, for example, swallowing is something you have to do really well, or you're going to have a problem. And then, if there is a problem with your respiratory or digestive systems, coughing is one common response, and vomiting is a common response, and both of those are mediated by the medulla. So, the common thread here is that these deal with very ancient, highly ancestral functions rather than more derived traits that we see in humans like higher order reasoning or complex emotions. This is much more basic, like stay alive kind of functions. So here is a figure of a human head. You can see in the middle here in purple, light blue, and darker blue, those are the three regions of the brainstem. So you have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And if you didn't hear that word in a particular voice, I recommend that you go back and watch some old Adam Sandler movies from when Adam Sandler made funny movies. To summarize the structure of the human brain, we looked at the cerebrum and its functions. We looked at the thalamus and the hypothalamus within the diencephalon, and then we looked at the brainstem and the cerebellum and the functions of each of those components. Now, one thing we did not do is look at the developmental pathway here, so don't worry about these kind of sequences. We're not going to talk about that. I just need you to be able to compare and contrast the components of the brain that we talked about.